This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook and Super Inframan. Thank you so very much. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I have returning to the show Seth Breedlove. Hey, Seth.
Hey.
And you have you've actually released two things since the last time you were on.
Yeah, surprise. We put out the Mothman Legacy on October 20th, and the Mark of the Bell Witch comes out December 15th, which, was honestly, it was intended this way. Our schedule was intended this way. The only thing that got changed a little bit was that Mothman Legacy got delayed from September 20th to October 20th, and that's why the release of the two is so closely tied together. And that was because of Mothman Legacy being released by a distributor who set the game plan and took that release out of my control. So I had no control over the release of that movie and when they did it. So I had a decision to make a couple weeks ago, actually, like 3 weeks ago, as to when we would release the Mark of the Bell Witch. And we had felt like, it might be overshadowed by Mothman Legacy if we released it in December. But at the same time, December 20th is the 200-year anniversary of the death of John Bell. Okay. And so I just decided we're just going to go for it and self-distribute it and release it in December when we originally intended. And so that's what we're going to do. So I'm excited. But I was pumped for both of these releases all year because there was an extremely wide release window between Momo, which was our last, sort of standard Small Town Monsters film, and Mothman Legacy. It was actually over a year, which is the longest we've gone, in between movies. There's usually two coming out per year, but just because of this year's schedule, it was a very big window between the two releases.
Did COVID push it back at all?
No. It honestly had nothing to do with COVID. It was just the distributor. We've never dealt with a big distributor before. We've distributed movies through a smaller distribution company that we signed a deal with back in 2017, and first of all, that was a disaster, and second of all, those movies that we signed to them had been out already, so they were retroactively distributing them to a wider audience. This was a full-scale distribution of one of our movies upon release, so we had never dealt with that. And basically, they have to have the movie at a certain date, and then they sit with that movie for like 3 months while they get a plan in order to release it. And with that comes losing all control of how the movie is actually released. Right. So it was eye-opening in some ways because I've never seen that side of things. But the long and short of it is, we had intended to release the movie in September, basically with the annual Mothman Festival. It was supposed to premiere there, and obviously that got canceled along with everything else. But they just set the release date for closer to Halloween, I think, was their plan.
Okay. You said the other deal with was a mess.
Oh yeah, that was I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, sure. But I need to do a podcast or something at some point just to give pointers to filmmakers, true indie filmmakers, on how to deal with distribution companies and what kind of deals to not sign and that kind of stuff. Because that was a really lousy deal that I signed, and thankfully I did some things that were in retrospect fairly intelligent. Like we held on to our own Amazon distribution rights, but it was not the best. It was not the best distribution deal that anyone's ever signed. I can guarantee you that.
All right. Well, so you've gone with the Mark of the Bell Witch, and why did you choose the Bell Witch?
We chose, okay, so there's a couple ways to answer this. We chose this title back in apparently 2017. So when I was talking to you about Mothman of Point Pleasant back in 2017, when that movie came out, we were already looking toward 2020 and making the Mark of the Bell Witch. We have... So Heather Mosier, who's actually in the movie, and she's our research girl, or researcher, or whatever you want to call her. I used to call her my research assistant, but at this point she does as much, if not more, research on the films than I do. So I just call her a researcher. She was actually in Adams, Tennessee that year doing preliminary work for us. Starting to talk to people in town and getting a read on how things would go if we made this movie. So as far back as 2017, this was on the radar. The real reason we picked it as a title was because, STM is like a family. It's comprised of literally family and then really close friends. And then everyone else who's come into it has become like family. And that's just how we run it. But two of the guys that have been doing this with me since 2015 are two of my oldest friends, Zach Palmisano and Jason Udis. And Jason was absolutely terrified of the Bell Witch as a child, which he had told me about and I thought was hilarious. And apparently he was like absolutely mortified of the Bell Witch. And at one point it got so bad that he was having like recurring nightmares and stuff. And his dad told him that the way to overcome his fear would be to basically draw a picture of the Bell Witch and then burn it in effigy, apparently. And he did it, and it worked. And it pretty much took care of it for years. But more recently, when we really started talking about what we wanted to do to get out of the sort of ufological or cryptid niche that we had, sort of built around ourselves. He, for some reason, suggested Bell Witch. And then when he told me about how terrified of it he was as a kid and still was today, I thought it was hilarious to mess with him to make that as our next movie. So really, we picked it because I thought we could have a lot of fun at Jason's expense. And the unfortunate part of it is Jason has been on every film shoot, some of the On the Trail of shoots, probably in terms of filming, Jason and Zach have been on more of the shoots than any other crew member except me. And unfortunately, because of COVID and some of the issues Jason's dealing with in his private life, he was the one crew member who didn't get to go on the Bell Witch shoot and was not involved in the production in any way. So that kind of sucks for me, because I really made it to mess with him. But we have some funny and somewhat scary, creepy kind of stories that happen behind the scenes. Not anything in Adams or anything like that, but Heather was having recurring dreams that involved the Bell Witch as far back as 2017, and so we thought we were going to get into some of our first sort of encounters with the supernatural in this movie, but unfortunately that didn't prove to be the case. It's all pretty boring, other than the dreams.
What kind of dreams were they?
You know what, Heather, so these are so specific that I feel like when I tell these stories, it's just nowhere near as creepy. But basically, in 2017, before she went to Adams on her, I guess you can call it a scouting trip, she had this dream that she was in a cabin, and she was in a cabin, and she was waiting to go to the Bell Witch Cave, and she was in this waiting area in this cabin, and there was an old woman in the cave. Apparently she had some sort of encounter with this old woman, not in the cave, in the cabin. She had some sort of encounter with this old woman. The woman was very unnerving and kind of creepy looking, as I recall it. And she had told Heather that she was looking forward to meeting us. And by us, she was talking about me and Jason and Zach and Small Town Monsters crew. And that when she met us, she thought we would have a lot of fun, was what she had told her. But the dreams got a lot more unnerving from there, which I actually didn't know about till more recently. I think we had actually finished making the movie, or were just about to make the movie. And Heather started having sort of recurring dreams where the Bell Witch would like come to her when she felt like her attention had deviated away from her. Like if Heather started putting focus on other work, the witch would come to her in these dreams and tell her she wanted her to put her focus back on her. But what was interesting was the dreams were so vivid that Heather had sketched out this image of the Bell Witch, and the image she shared with me ended up inspiring one of the creature or monster designs that we came up with for the Bell Witch in the movie, which is the sort of like cloaked figure with the antlers and the deer skull on its head. Yeah, that's based on Heather's nightmare. She had actually sent me the sketch, and I based our design on that. So yeah, there were multiple dreams. Some of them were pretty unnerving though. Like she would grab. I know one of them, Heather told me about, the witch had grabbed her face or like stuck her hand on her face or something like that. And when she did it was like really cold, but it was so cold that it hurt. And it was creepy. And she told me all this, and I genuinely expected us to encounter something. You know, like while we were in Adams, you hear so many stories about people having like power drain on batteries and all this kind of stuff. We had none of that on our shoot. I mean, we really didn't run into any issues. It was smooth sailing all the way through production and even into finishing the movie. So we, apparently we got through all of that without being cursed. But I think we were very respectful of the legend, despite the fact I don't necessarily believe the Bell Witch exists. We were very respectful of her while we were in Adams, and I would highly recommend most people do the same.
Now with COVID, how did you get around? How did you deal with that with filming?
You know what? COVID during Bell was considerably easier than COVID during Mothman Legacy, and that's because Mothman Legacy was in the middle of filming when the lockdowns went into effect.
Oh, okay.
So what happened was when we shot Bell Witch, it was August. So you were looking at a point where the numbers were way down. Tennessee had opened pretty much all the way back up when we were there. I mean, we were there on in a very specific point in time where it looked as if the tide had turned, and so things were a little more free. So as far as filming the documentary, we wore masks when we were inside the cabin filming interviews and things like that. Some of the interviews were conducted outside, so that didn't even play much of a role. But then when we got into shooting the recreations, which obviously make up a huge part of the movie, the actors in this movie are not necessarily actors. It's all family, and if it's not family, it's really close friends, and people who work on SDM. So it was less probably stringent than it would have been if we were really hiring actors and all that sort of stuff. Plus, it's such a small crew to begin with. I think at any given time, the most people that would have been on quote unquote set would have been like maybe eight or nine people in the house where we were filming. And again, it's almost all family. I mean, Amy, who plays Betsy, is Adrian's cousin. Adrian, my wife, plays the witch. Adrian's dad, Tom, plays John Bell. So it was a very small scale cast and crew to make the whole movie. Obviously, everything we do is pretty small scale, but it was easier. I think it was just easier because of the timing. It was just that it was a very specific window that we happened to shoot that movie during, where everything seemed to be opening up, and it wasn't as scary either. It wasn't as scary as it was when we were shooting Legacy, because Legacy was like, we went back to filming Mothman Legacy, the interviews and stuff, the first weekend that West Virginia opened back up. Wow. So it was a pretty crazy shoot. And I shot, like, all of the Mothman Legacy recreations were shot solely by me, because none of our crew really wanted to leave their house when we were filming them. So I ended up shooting all the recreations by myself, with basically like a one-man crew. So yeah, Legacy, Bell Witch was like very, it was very relaxed. It was just a lot of fun to film. And then it was very inspiring, kind of in the same way that like Momo was, where we were all just having fun and creatively getting to do stuff that we thought would be, unique. And it was also interesting. The recreations on Bell Witch were shot by Santino Vitale. He was the director of photography. The documentary portion of the movie, the director of photography was Zach, because he's always my DP on the movies. But Santino basically DP'd the recreations, even though Zach was there. And it was kind of a cool working environment, because I would actually hand a camera to Zach and I'd be like, can you go off in this room and shoot stuff with this person and this person while Santino and I are doing this scene in here. So I think it freed everyone up to kind of just be creative and do stuff that we normally wouldn't do. Like, I know Zach would be off in one room with like Adrian in her witch costume, shooting her doing something, and just kind of random cut in shots. I know a lot of the shots in the movie with the probe lens, like the shots that get real close to the ground or up in the ceiling or whatever, those are all kind of like spontaneous, just stuff we were shooting in the moment. And it was just a really creative environment, like compared to, and coming off of months of being locked in our homes, like that was kind of a godsend.
Now you said you don't know if that there's anything to the Bell Witch. Why do you say that?
Well, yeah, it's hard to put into words, because I do think there's something to the Bell Witch, in that it's hard. Again, it's very difficult for me to explain. The story itself, you can pretty clearly get a read on the fact that we don't know what happened 200 years ago.
Right.
The historians that we're following in this movie, especially Brandon Barker and Tim Henson, they're still trying to piece together what exactly took place. And Tim has been involved in this story for over 40 years. And I would say, and I think this would be a realistic statement, and he'd probably agree, that not a day goes by where he's not doing some sort of work relating back to the Bell family. Huh. And so for him still to be attempting to piece together what actually happened 40 years later, and I think he still would say he has a long way to go. I don't know that we're ever going to know what exactly happened. Well, sure. I would wager that we won't. And
how much of it has been exaggerated by urban legend?
Exactly, yeah, and that's the problem. Is with 200 years passing, this is the same thing we explored with something like the Flatwoods Monster, but that was 70 years ago or whatever. Yeah. This is 200 years down the road, and you've had so much added to the story, and in some cases added by friends and family members and people connected to the Bell family, who you wouldn't expect to necessarily be making stuff up, but who very likely did. So I just don't know that we'll ever actually know what happened. Having said that, there is a very real element to the Bell Witch that I find. It's weird. I don't find it scary or unnerving. I'm very curious about it in a way, just because I think there's a life to the spirit, to the witch, that makes me think about these types of stories in a way I never have. You hear these ideas about like tulpas and that kind of thing. Yeah. I'm not going down that road necessarily, but for me to put into words what I've been thinking of for the last like 5 months while we've really investigated the story is difficult. But the witch herself has a life, has taken on a life that I think is really interesting, and it isn't just the cultural impact of a fictional character on a town or something like that. And so that's what I mean. It's hard for me to put into words, but there's some sort of reality to that character that it's almost like it's come to life simply in the telling of the story, whether the story is real or not. Right. That character, real or fictional, whatever you want to call her, is very much alive and well in Adams today. And I don't just mean in a cultural way, in the way that I think of something like, maybe Mothman in Point Pleasant. It's not to that extent. It's a different vibe. There's something going on in Adams that I'm very curious to learn more about. And this is one of those cases where ideally I would love for the Mark of the Bell Witch to do astronomically well, so I could turn around and go back down and tell more of the story. Because the fact is, we got through the 1800s, sort of the MV Ingram retelling of the Bell Witch story, but there's a lot more to that story. There's friends and neighbors that encountered things. There's things going on today that we conducted interviews about that are not in this movie, because that's not the story that the movie was trying to tell. Every movie we make takes on a life of its own once you're into the edit. And this was one of those cases where very early on I realized, crap, like we're going to lose some really great stories, some really creepy stories that are sort of modern day, encounters that just do not fit with what we were trying to do here. Yeah. And there's a lot more to this. There's an entire interview, man, that is not in this movie that just came up out of nowhere. We basically encountered this girl while we were down there filming, whose aunt and uncle had owned property. Now, she was totally off on her historical, what she was remembering historically, but that's not her fault. It was what she was told as a kid, and she was, she's going off of something that she was told like 20 years ago. But her aunt and uncle had owned property on the former Batts farmland or homestead, something like that. She had been told as a child that it was Kate Batts' home. Kate Batts obviously is very tied to the Bell Witch legend, but she had stories relating back to that house that were really cool. But the thing that really stood out was that she was told, and apparently her aunt and uncle were told when they bought this house, that every time a man bought the house, he would die in 2 years. And apparently it happened with her uncle. He died 2 years after they bought this house, but she has really fond memories of going to that house. I have pictures of her as a kid at the house. I mean, it's a really great angle, but it did not fit with this story. So there's still so much for me to do with that Bell Witch story. I wish we could do like a 5-hour director's cut.
Well, you can always do a part 2 eventually, one way or the other.
Yeah.
So first of all, the production values on this are fantastic. You do a great job of making it seem super creepy.
Cool.
The thing that strikes me, I've never looked thoroughly into the Bell Witch case simply because a lot of these cases, like once they get so popular, they start to get polluted very easily by, all kinds of stuff. And but looking at the bare bones of this, I mean, this seems like a fairly typical poltergeist case.
Yeah, aspects of it certainly do. And I would be interested to look into how much people that sort of pioneered the idea of a poltergeist, if they had looked into this case or used this case as the backbone or any sort of research for those concepts, because certainly in the making of it, that was the word that came up far more than haunting.
Yeah.
Like haunting anymore. When I hear people talk about the Bell Witch who are actually familiar with it, you don't hear that word very often relating to the Bell Witch. The other thing you never hear ever is the word ghost. You never hear the word ghost in connection with the Bell Witch. And honestly, the word witch is sort of a weird, it's a strange. Now I think in this movie we explain in a historical context why they called the spirit the Bell Witch, but the family themselves referred to it as a spirit, and so certainly the poltergeist angle is a strong runner for what was actually occurring on the Bell property, and a lot of that relates back to Betsy and her age.
Yep.
Which again, we aren't sure, by the way, that she was 11 or 12 or 13 when all of this takes place, because there are aspects of her age that don't make a lot of sense. Tim Henson believes she was older, and maybe as old as 16 when this all kicked off. And the reason is, she ended up marrying that William Powell, and Powell, because of his standing in the community, would have been doing himself a pretty great disservice by marrying someone so young. Mm-hmm. He would have damaged his reputation. And there's other aspects to this that Tim, again, you honestly have to talk to Tim really to get the details, but Tim's belief is that she was older. She might have been, 13, 14 when this kicked off, but by the time it was all ending in 1820, she would have been in her mid to late teens, according to Tim, whereas MV Ingram is saying she's anywhere from 11 to 12 years old in 1817 and 16, 17 when it all sort of is wrapping up. Just know that there are no aspects of this case that aren't vigorously disputed by any two people, and that would include all three of the historians who we focus on in this movie: Tim, Pat, and Brandon. They'll argue with each other, about pretty much everything. It's one of my favorite things about being around all three of them is kind of listening to them go over their own opinions on this case.
Right. Well, I mean, poltergeist activity happens with people all the time. It doesn't have to be a pubescent girl.
A preteen girl. Yeah.
That's become a trope for it, but that is not necessarily. It takes things like trauma. It takes the right person. If the area is known for stuff, it tends to ramp up activity, which was one of the questions. Is there a lot of history of weirdness in that area?
Well, I mean, so certainly there, I guess, it's like one of those things where I wanted that, as bad as this sounds from an objective documentarian standpoint, I wanted there to be, because I thought, that would be such a cool sort of tie-in to some of the other stories we've done about things that you don't necessarily associate with, like the Bell Witch. So like you think of a place like Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where there's this long history of weird stuff that goes way back before, the Mothman sightings. And there's a history up to present day that extends far beyond Mothman sightings and into, UFOs and ghosts and all sorts of weird stuff. And Chestnut Ridge came to mind. And I've heard people like Troy Taylor state that his belief is that that Adams might have a portal or be a portal or a window area, especially in and around like the Bell Witch Cave. And so I went there hoping I would find that kind of history, and I didn't. So that was the unfortunate thing, but it could also be that I didn't spend enough time really digging into that history. I just know that directly in Adams, there isn't that kind of strange backstory you would expect to find from another place, like Point Pleasant or the Chestnut Ridge. You certainly have multiple phenomena taking place around the same time as the Bell Witch and up to present day. One of the most unfortunate things about the making of the movie and the cutting of the movie is that I had to cut out a couple of my favorite stories, both of them from Tim, and both of them involving his personal sightings of spook lights. And mystery lights have been one of my favorite subjects for the last couple of years. We did an entire episode of On the Trail of UFOs about mystery lights just because I'm so fascinated by it. And Tim's seen them, and Tim is the most skeptical. This is not a guy that even believes the Bell Witch is a real thing, and he, he's as skeptical as they come, but he's seen, the mystery lights there. So it's something that does happen. But as far as like other phenomena taking place, like Bigfoot or UFOs, that kind of thing, Dogman, any of that stuff, it's non-existent. You can't really find any sightings like that. And once you get there, it kind of makes sense that there wouldn't be. It looks a heck of a lot like Ohio, honestly. It looks like very much like my part where I live in near Wayne County, Ohio. It looks a lot like this. Farmland, flat, farmland, the occasional field, or the occasional patch of forest, the occasional hill, but it's not what you picture in your mind when you think of Tennessee. It's not the river valleys of like Memphis, and it's not the Smoky Mountains, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of Tennessee. And so you don't have a place where you necessarily would. I guess it doesn't visually. It doesn't, play into that Chestnut Ridge or Point Pleasant sort of area. What you do have is a place that it certainly can look awfully creepy when they're doing the dark fire tobacco barn burnings that they do there during September and October, which is where they grow all this tobacco in that area, and then they hang the tobacco in these barns, and then they smoke the tobacco. And what it looks like is they friggin' lit a barn on fire. I mean, it's the weirdest thing, and the entire area will cover up with smoke. And, it's certainly a place that looks creepy, but it doesn't have that crazy kind of like supernatural or paranormal or cryptid or any of that backstory that you find in some of the other places we've been.
Okay. For people who aren't aware, why don't you give just an overview of what the Bell Witch was? I realize we kind of skipped over that, assuming that people know the story, but not everyone necessarily knows the story. So in a quick version, what happened with the Bell Witch? Yeah,
so between the years of 1817 and you could go up to 1821, really, even though John died in 1820. This family, the Bell family, who lived near the town of Adams, Tennessee, at the time known as Adams Station, Tennessee, they were, I guess you could call it under attack. I'd actually hesitate to use that, under attack, but you could say under attack by an unseen entity that resided in their house, who referred to herself as Old Kate, or Kate the Witch, or Kate Bat's Witch. The family called it a spirit. In 1817, when everything kicked off, it sort of kicked off with a series of events that began with a sighting and a shooting of a weird animal in John Bell. He was the patriarch of the family. In his field, the creature he shot at was apparently like a rabbit with a dog's head, or a dog's body with a rabbit head. It kind of depends on which version of the story you're listening to.
Right.
But he shoots at this thing, and shortly thereafter, there started to be strange knocks in the walls, creaking, all this kind of stuff, sort of coming from the outside of the house. And then as winter set in, the sounds start to move inside the house, and it's still, just strange noises, creaking and things like that. And then eventually, the whatever this thing is starts to take a shine, or pay attention, I guess, to Betsy Bell, who was the youngest in the family. And it started out, with like pulling her hair and sort of messing with her. And then it became more and more violent. And over time, it became a full-blown, attack. I mean, it would throw her out of the bed and beat her and throw her around the room and stuff like that. Scratch her, all that kind of good stuff. Wonderful. And then eventually this thing began to gain a voice, and the voice took on a personality, and the family could converse with it and talk to it. And that's one aspect of this story that we did not spend a lot of time on in the movie, is that people were having full-blown conversations with this thing. People were coming from all over to talk to, the spirit, and it could tell them things about their own lives and their history. It knew things about people that it shouldn't have known. And the thing that I always think is so interesting about this is there's this idea that this is all fictional, that this whole thing's fictional. If it's fiction, it is a masterwork. Like if it's fiction, M.V. Ingram and I believe Charles Bailey Bell, I believe, is the guy who wrote the other book. There's two books. There's the red book and the black book, and the black book was written by Charles Bailey Bell. Our movie is mostly going off of M.V. Ingram's book, because that was the original. That was the one that came out first, and then about 30 years later, you had Charles Bailey Bell's. But it's such a if it's fiction, it is an absolute masterwork with a very, very defined central antagonist, a character that has a personality that comes to life as you're reading it, and you get a sense for who that witch was, that spirit was, just in reading M.V. Ingram's book. I mean, she has a personality, and it comes to life. And as someone who reads fiction and is a storyteller, if it's a fictional character, it is one of the most well-defined fictional characters I've ever read. And I'm talking about the spirit here.
Yeah.
To the extent that I almost feel like the family is much less interesting than the spirit herself, or itself, or whatever you want to call it. So the rundown of the story is basically that the spirit shows up. She does tell the family that the reason she's there is to kill old John Bell. She calls him Old Jack Bell, but she's talking about John Bell Sr. And in 1820, she does just that, and he dies at potentially at her hand, if you believe M.V. Ingram's retelling of the story. She supposedly poisoned him.
Right.
He dies, and then about a year later, she goes away for what she says will be 7 years, and then she comes back 7 years later and spends a little bit of time with John Bell Jr. At his house, but most of the family ignores her, and in so doing, It seems like they took her power away and she kind of disappeared over time. She did claim she'd be back, I think it was like 109 years later or something. She promised she would return, and she never did, at least not that we know of. So that's kind of the rundown, the quick synopsis, the cliff notes of what the Bell Witch story is all about.
So, I mean, you start with that sort of weird cryptid and a Thunderbird type of sighting. And then you got the strange lights, which are seen around the same time period. There's what was the point? Oh, yeah, her talking about things in different places. It is a absolute similar case to what you had with Jeff the Mongoose, who would do the exact same thing. And you've had other poltergeists who do that. Or even if you take the bigger one there, the the one they did the second Conjuring movie on, that the Warrens had nothing to do with, but they put them in there anyway. I can't remember the name of it, but I mean that assumed a personality as well, whether or not it started out as a poltergeist being emanated from one of the kids or not. It eventually seemed to form its own sort of personality as someone who had lived there before, whether or not someone who lived there was able to, pick up on that energy and use it, whether she was picking the stuff up psychically. I mean, she was giving accurate information about stuff that had happened there prior to them living there, So, I mean, this stuff isn't unheard of.
Yeah. And I mean, it got to the extent that she was, one of the famous stories is that there was a man that came to visit the Bells from like London. I believe it was London, or I think it was London. And like he basically, the witch shows up, she talks to him, she goes back to London, she talks to his mother and father, and then comes back and relays messages to him from the mother and father in London in their voice, and then relays a message from him back to them, and again, like so much of this, you're wondering, how do we have any idea how much of this happened, if any of it happened?
Right.
But the one thing the thing that I come back to is how like masterful the storytelling is here, but not in a traditional sense like you would expect to find in a book that is comprised of made-up stories meant to seem real from the late 1800s. I would not expect, if I was making up a story like this, I don't know that I would be telling this story in the way that Ingram does if it was fictional. It is a very scattered series of small events that are put together in a book. It's the same way you would find a book about real life, like life of a small family on a farm in the early 1800s. I think this is how it would play out. But if you were going to fictionalize that, I think you would go with something a little more romanticized, more dramatic. You would find a way to really, the thing that I kept coming to when I was making the movie was I kept thinking, I wish there was more of a build to John Bell's death, because you would expect that if you were fictionalizing it, that events would ramp up, right? Things would get crazier and crazier, and that eventually John Bell would die in this very dramatic fashion. And that isn't the case. Some of the most dramatic and creepy events happen very early in the book. And then later it gets to the point where people are just hanging out, talking to the witch, and having conversations, or she's singing them hymns or whatever, and it's just not the way I would have fictionalized that if I was doing it. That's not, again, I'm not stating that I believe this is 100% accurate but I believe there are historically accurate elements to the book. And I think there's enough accuracy historically in the book to at least make someone think that there might be something to the supernatural side of the story. Because even though Ingram gets a lot of things wrong, historically, he gets a lot of things right too.
Yeah.
And it just makes you think there might be something to all of this, that would lead you to believe that maybe they really did experience, a poltergeist or whatever you want to call it.
Right. It could have been an entity picking up on the energy. It could have been generated just by Betsy. We don't understand how that stuff works, even though we understand some of the criteria that seems to create it.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like I said, it does ring true. Like the stuff that happened to them does ring true of other poltergeist accounts. A lot of them start off with the knockings and things like that, and then slowly build into, in some cases, actual conversations like Jeff the Mongoose did.
Mm-hmm. And 200 years prior to a lot of that stuff hitting, I guess it beggars the belief that they could have fictionalized so much of this.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find it difficult to believe the whole thing's fiction. I believe there are definitely fictional elements to the Bell Witch legend, and some of that, I think we can learn about through people like Brandon Barker, who's one of the main characters and who has an understanding of folklore and how folklore is invented and where it comes from and how it morphs with time. But and there are things about the story that we were able to point out as being false. There's it's funny because one of them is this moment where Heather tells the story about how Drury Bell never married because he was so terrified of the Bell Witch. And then we interviewed a really renowned historian whose specialty is like slave history. And he talks about how Drury Bell actually married one of his slaves. It was never known because he had married his slave, which wasn't allowed at that point in time. And it was an interesting way to point out, this is the legend, this is the reality, and we have no idea how much of the story is the same way, how much of it is real and how much of it is false. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure it matters either, because it's such a fascinating story, and it's such a good story, and it's played such a key role in Adams' history and the state of Tennessee's history, really. For a lot of people, this is for older people, especially, the Bell Witch was sort of the original, like, Amityville.
Yeah.
I mean, this was something a lot of people grew up aware of. And I know in the first trailer we put out for it, we called it like the most infamous haunting in American history. And I think for a lot of people, that is the case. It was a very well-known story.
Let me ask you this. Is there anything you uncovered that would suggest that maybe John was abusing Betsy in any way?
No. And, okay. That was sort of invented for that book, which might have been called An American Haunting. I own the book. It's
no, I didn't get it from a book. It's again a common thing that tends to generate poltergeist activity.
Right. And well, the reason I said that is so that there's a book, and I think it's called An American Haunting, but I can't remember. And it came out, and it was, I don't want to say it was shady, but it was kind of a weird way of promoting the book, where they inserted a lot of fictional elements into what was promoted as basically being a historical work of nonfiction.
Gotcha.
So they inserted these fictional elements into it, and one of them was that John Bell was sexually abusing Betsy, and that Betsy manifested a poltergeist, and it took, like all that stuff. And that was what also went into the movie An American Haunting, that came out in like 2007 or whenever that was, with Sissy Spacek. And it was a fairly popular movie. And so a lot of people have sort of taken that to be like, if not reality, something that historians might agree upon or something like that.
Right.
And it's just not the case. Like when we made the movie, I kept asking people about that, and it's something that comes up a lot, and people have hypothesized that maybe that was the case, but there's no proof necessarily that any of that took place.
Okay.
And really there's no evidence to back up that any of it took place at all. No documents. There's no, Betsy never talked that way later in life. So there's very little to back up that idea.
I mean, it's like I said, it's just one of those triggers with poltergeist cases that sometimes, especially since the poltergeist killed her father,
right.
Subconsciously you're thinking, okay, if you're generating subconscious energy to attack your father, why?
Sure.
What element?
And you're going to have like a better understanding. Seriously, like you'll have a much better understanding of that stuff than I will, because this is, I mean, in a lot of ways, this movie was my introduction to these types of stories. I'm familiar with ghost stories and hauntings and poltergeists and all that kind of stuff, but I hadn't spent any time looking into those stories before this. So this is really this is where all my knowledge of this kind of thing comes from. So you'll have a better, contextually, you'll understand all of this probably far better than I do.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense in the state of a poltergeist, case. Mm-hmm. It's unusual the her actually killing John. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a little out of the ordinary for this type of stuff, but the way it progressed, the way it decreases and everything, all that kind of fits with other cases we're aware of. And John's ill health, he was sick. He had something going on.
Yeah, and so he started to have issues right around the time where this all kicked off. And it was basically like he'd be eating, he couldn't swallow. It was he would have fits, he would have seizures and things like that. And it just got to the point where that was eventually what took him out. Like in 1820, he collapsed during the month of, I believe it was November. It might have been October, and then was bedridden for a while until December 20th. And on this December 20th, that's when, he took something. There was something in a vial beside his bed. He took a sip of it, and he died later that night. And the legend goes that, the witch is the one that handed him that vial. So,
right.
So,
and of course, we don't really know what was in the vial.
No, I think I think what most people agree upon is that it was arsenic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and there's a doctor. They took the vial or whatever to a doctor, and he supposedly, confirmed that it was arsenic. And I think even some of the historians believe that's what would have killed John, would have been this arsenic. But again, the movie ends with a very, I don't want to give it away, but there's a very frank discussion, or interesting discussion, I guess, that takes place toward the very end of the movie between the three historians about another theory as to what might have killed John Bell. And obviously, it's something that's been theorized about probably as long as the story's been out there. And the second you hear the story, you start to come up with alternate ideas as to what might have happened, besides a spirit haunting and killing a man. And that's, it's part of the fun of the story, to me anyways, is thinking about what happened, what might have happened, like what avenues haven't we thought of yet as to what might have happened. It's like the ultimate cold case in a way. And that was like when I thought of, when we were figuring out the look of the movie, that was the first thing I thought of was cold case. It's a murder mystery, essentially. We don't know what happened. And I started thinking of those historians as cops. And so when I talked to Zach the first time about the look of the movie, I told him I want it to be a haunted house. I want it to look like a haunted house movie meets a police procedural. And that was one of the reasons why Santino was kind of the cinematographer on the recreations, while Zach was the cinematographer on the documentary. It would help visually, I think, distinguish the two sides from one another.
Yeah.
And so you get this kind of like gritty handheld vibe to the scenes with the historians, like where they're just talking to one another. And those are police procedural moments. And then the haunted house vibe comes in, during the recreations.
There was a story in there. This is kind of interesting that talks about Betsy. See, like the Bell Witch became a family of witches at some point. It actually multiplied, and that part I never knew. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, that's a super creepy side of the story, where, basically I think this would have been during sort of the tail end of everything, but I might be wrong about that. There was a set of 4, like voices essentially move into the house. They have weird names: Jerusalem, Psychography, Mathematics, and I cannot remember what the last one is. But those 4 voices take up residence in the home, and they harass the family to an insane degree. Their personalities are very different from the spirits as well. They seem to be a family of witches, is what they're called in the book, but they're these, voices that are coming out of nowhere. There seem to be a mother and then 2 young girls, and then a little boy. And they harass the family until one day, Betsy goes to a neighboring house, and while she's there visiting, they see a woman and 2 girls who they've never seen before walking down the street, and they approach the house where Betsy is, and they never seem to notice Betsy or the other girl that Betsy was with. They kind of ignore them, and as they're watching them, a little boy shows up, and the 2 girls and the little boy find some saplings, and apparently they swing on them and play with the saplings. And it's around this time that the man of the house, whatever house Betsy was visiting, I forget who it is. It was like a family relative, but while she's there, the man of the house comes home. The women ask him to get his gun. He does, and then he proceeds to fire upon the strange woman and 2 girls and little boy.
But he couldn't see them.
Right, he couldn't see them, but the two girls could. So they pointed to where they were. They had hidden behind a log, and they point to where they are, and he takes a shot and apparently hits the little boy and wounds him. And later that night, the family's back at the house, and the witch starts laughing and proceeds to tell everyone how Mr. Porter, I think it was, is such a good shot, and how he had wounded the little boy, Jerusalem, with a shot. And then I think that kind of was the culmination of it when it comes to the witch family. The witch family just kind of disappeared around that time as well. But it is like that story, and the story of the neighbor where the witch crawled into bed with him. Those are 2 of the weirder side stories of the Bell Witch.
Because wasn't the Bell Witch friendly with that neighbor?
Yeah, it seemed like they kind of had a thing going on. Yeah.
So that family story almost reminds me vaguely of like a wild man sighting or something like that. And the other thing that struck me was that it said that the witch would give, was it John's wife, fruit and stuff like that?
Yeah, she took a liking to Lucy, and she would sing to her. She would there's a really famous story about Lucy getting very sick, like almost to the point of death. And the spirit was beside herself with worry, like trying to make sure she was okay. And apparently that's where the fruit came from. So the fruit as well was from like the British Isles. So supposedly the spirit disappears and then comes back with all this fruit for Lucy, to help, nurse her back to health, apparently. But she was very concerned about Lucy's well-being and her health. And I think even the boys she didn't dislike. She seemed to take a liking to some, the Drury and John more so than Betsy and John Sr.
So the fruit almost again makes me think of like the sort of spirit gifting type of thing. But and if it's from England or something, I mean, it would basically be an apport, which does not go outside the realm of typical poltergeist activity. So that's another thing where this stuff all kind of makes sense, which makes me wonder how much of it's legit, because if they're making it up with information they wouldn't have had on poltergeist cases,
Yeah, they're inventing an entire genre of story, like story elements there. I mean, that's stuff that is widely acknowledged now in that kind of in those circles in I guess poltergeist lore and even haunting lore.
Yeah,
like a lot of this is way ahead of its time. Now, there's a story from West Virginia that has similarities to this, called the Wizard Clip, and there's elements of it that have sort of seem to run similar to that, but I mean, it's just a lot of this was the first time we had encountered this sort of story, and certainly in the late 1800s, this had to have seemed like completely out of left field for most people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. How did the skeptics back then deal with it? There were plenty of them, weren't there?
Yeah, well, they accused the family of hoaxing it all. Betsy and her brothers were frequently said to be ventriloquists, which is how they threw the voice. So when people would come to the house and interact with the witch, it was just them throwing their voice around. Except the family never made any money off of this. And I mean, I don't know what it would have gained them to begin with.
Yeah.
To do it, if they weren't going to make any money off of it. They certainly never made any money off of it. And they weren't a very wealthy family, compared to some of the others in the area. And honestly, at that point in time, anyone in that part of Tennessee was probably not very wealthy, not hugely wealthy. It would be a lot of settlers just trying to make a living and building their farms. Now, I know there was a huge plantation somewhat close to Adams Station, but Adams Station itself, I don't think any of the people in that area were wealthy.
Now, there is a story about Andrew Jackson going out there, and I've heard mixed things, but you seem to have found that did happen?
Well, I would say we have there's been a lot of dispute over this part of the story, and most of the dispute comes from the fact that people don't believe that Andrew Jackson would have had any reason to be there near Adams Station. What Tim has been able to find is that he owned land right down the road from the Bell Farm. I mean, there's no reason why he couldn't have been there at that time. And we know that his sons, that Drury and John Jr., may have served under Andrew Jackson as well. So there would be a connection to the family. Now, as for whether or not the events unfolded the way we understand them to have unfolded from the legend, again, who knows? But we can at least if you want to place Jackson in that area at that time, he has a reason to be there. And I think that's a big, for a lot of people for years, that was, sort of the point where they could write the story off, because Jackson would have had no reason to be there supposedly. But
right.
Tim's found documentation that he owned property there. So he very well could have been there and probably was.
So one of the modern stories you do talk about in the book is that someone stole the gravestones for these people.
Yeah, that's happened multiple times. Originally the Bellwood section of the movie, which is the middle, there's kind of a brief interlude at the middle point of the movie where we go to Bellwood Cemetery and Pat Fitzhugh and Tim Henson and Brandon have this conversation. Originally, there was a story there about two different incidents where people drove their cars back up into Bellwood and attempted to run over the obelisk. This is apparently
what's the obelisk for people who don't know?
Yeah, at the dead center of Bellwood Cemetery, which is literally the Bell family cemetery. It's just this massive obelisk that's been erected in honor of the Bell family. And there are some strange aspects to that fact. One is the fact that the Bell family, again, was not wealthy, not terribly wealthy. And they certainly, while they were locals and they play a role in the town's history, it kind of begs belief that this family has become the most renowned aspect of Adams' history, because they're kind of an unremarkable family in a lot of ways. And apparently some of this has to do with the Masons and the fact that a distant relative eventually put a lot of money into building that cemetery and really helping to push them to the forefront of local history. But yeah, there have been multiple instances where people stole headstones, but especially from John Sr.'s grave, because I think that was the easiest one to get to back in the day. But the story that's told is that these kids from Nashville came to Adams. They stole John and Lucy's headstones. They put them in the back of their car, and then as they were driving home, they got in a car accident, and at least two of the kids died. And that's not the only story like that. There are others involving other members of the Bell family. So apparently people try to take these things as souvenirs, and it doesn't work out very well for them.
And someone tried to run into the obelisk?
So yeah. So there's been two instances where people tried to run into the obelisk, and apparently one of them actually succeeded, because I believe at one point in time that obelisk was a lot taller. So they actually had to rebuild the obelisk. But there's been two instances where people drove into the obelisk or tried to. They erected this sort of big concrete wall around the obelisk now, and on the other side of that obelisk is the headstones for a lot of the family, and that was put up pretty much to stop people from running their car into the obelisk.
Well, who would do that? Like it's like you're going to destroy your car.
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't know. Two people apparently.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I guess it shows you the level of obsession with this stuff with some people.
For sure.
I mean, I don't know why they'd want to destroy it, but clearly something was bugging them.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You talk about all the stuff going on in the world at that time period too, from the volcanic eruption in Southeast Asia that caused basically a mini ice age.
Right.
And there were a few other things in the area that I don't exactly remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, I thought that stuff was really important for historical context. I don't know why. I think an audience watching this movie really needs to understand what life would have been like at that point in time. And it was a weird time in history during that year, during 1817, when all this kicked off. Yeah. And yeah, like you said, there was this whole year without a summer, where basically the volcanic eruption had blacked out the sun, and for a year there was no summer, so the crops died. There were no. It was a literal dark time in history.
And they probably didn't know about the volcano then either.
Right. And even if they did, they would have learned far, way after it had happened.
Yeah.
So everyone's going to be assuming this is the end of the world, which I believe is what Dewey Edwards actually says. And the other thing is that there was a huge earthquake there in Tennessee.
That was it. Yeah.
The river runs backwards. It was just a strange point in Tennessee history. And then in the middle of it, this starts happening. And so I felt like that was such an important piece of setting up the story for people. It's funny, there was an early cut of this movie where it was like 27 minutes or something before the Bell Witch even showed up. I had to actually play around with the chronology of what happened. I believe in the movie, we introduced the noises and sounds in the house before we introduced the hair, the ghost hair, and the giant bird. But those things happen prior to the noises. Right. Those things happened before. But the movie was like, you were literally like 27 minutes into the movie before the Bell Witch even made her first appearance. And I thought there's a point where people are going to not care anymore if the first 27 minutes are all local history.
Right. That's a possibility. Yeah. But I think that's really important because it puts the area under more stress, and stress is one of those things that creates poltergeists. Mm-hmm. So, you're looking at an area that the whole area is having all this weird stuff. I'm sure, people were depressed, people were stressed out. They didn't know how they were going to make it year to year at this point with all the stuff going on.
For sure.
There's part of an engine there that might be fueling this poltergeist activity. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think it was the folklorist may have said, he talks about she liked boundary areas. And that is something you find with all paranormal stuff, that they like liminality. So again, this is a very subtle thing that they, these people who are telling this story back 200 years ago would not have known about liminality and the paranormal.
Right.
So the fact that so much of this stuff is happening at liminal periods also lends some truth to it. Mm-hmm. We may not understand why that's the case, but yeah, boundary areas are where this stuff tends to manifest the most.
Yeah. Brandon did such a good job in sort of putting those things in a context that I think people who don't have an awareness of these types of stories, I think this is a great introduction to it.
Yeah.
And some of that might have to do with the fact that it was an introduction to it for me as well. So,
and sometimes that works well. Because you're not going in, like we started this episode kind of on the assumption that everyone knew what the Bell Witch was. And it took about half an hour before I realized, not everyone probably knows the Bell Witch story as well known and popular as it is.
Right.
There were probably a few people out there going, what is the story, Yeah. So when you approach something not knowing anything about it, you're asking the type of questions that you need to ask to tell the story properly.
Yep. Yeah. I think too, for me, it was approaching it in a way that I already know I'm going to hear from 1,000 people that know this story who are like, well, I already knew this story. Like I thought maybe this would be modern day retelling of it. But I think a whole new generation of people don't actually know this story. And so I was trying to approach it in a way too that would be a good introduction for people who might be completely unfamiliar with the Bell Witch to begin with. So and still introduce, you can do one of two things. So many of the ghost stuff that's on like TV or the supernatural stuff that's on TV, it spends the duration of its runtime either on people running around in the dark with flashlights or whatever, or or it spends all of its runtime on theories about what is behind the phenomenon. And what I wanted to do was to get the theories into the film, but do it in a way that didn't feel like we were intruding into what is otherwise just a straight up retelling of a story, you know? So that was a tightrope we were walking too. And it was tricky because we were coming off of Mothman Legacy, and Mothman Legacy, about, you know, maybe like 30% of its runtime is dedicated to that sort of thing. Yeah. Like exploring theories as to the origins of the Mothman. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to find a way to do that and insert it directly into the storytelling, so it felt like it was a more natural thread that was woven, you know, throughout the fabric of the movie.
I mean, it works. I enjoyed this greatly, and like I said, I had some familiarity with it, but there was a lot of stuff here that I did not know, and if anything, I've walked away more convinced that this was legitimate. I mean, I think there was probably something to it, but again, it hits so many marks dead on for typical poltergeist cases and cases like this, that a lot of it just makes sense, you know, like it's like, oh, okay, it makes sense that this was a poltergeist case, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And some of it probably was fictionalized, but I mean, that's how everything works. People tell stories and stories get exaggerated, but there's some key pieces in there that are very specific, you know?
Yeah, agreed.
So this is out where? On December 15th?
Yeah, December 15th. It's already available for digital pre-order on Vimeo, so Vimeo on demand, DVDs and Blu-rays at smalltownmonsters.com, and then Amazon. It will hit Amazon on December 15th as well. So those are the platforms as of now. It's a smaller release docket than, you know, our previous few releases, but I'm also excited to self-distribute something again.
I bet. What do you? Any thoughts on where you're going next?
Yeah. So 2021 is going to be like by far the biggest year we've had. We've already got, so for 2021 we already have On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Journey shot. We have On the Trail of UFOs, Dark Sky. We have On the Trail of Hauntings, which is, we shot the first episode already. And then we have On the Trail of Bigfoot, The Discovery. Then we have On the Trail of the Lake Michigan Mothman. And then we have the next sort of classic SDM movie will be Howl of the Rougarou. Oh. And those all come out next year. On the Trail of Hauntings is like it's our first, it's episodic, like On the Trail of UFOs was, but it's exclusive to our Small Town Monster Squad YouTube membership platform thing that we launched last month. So we're kind of excited about that because the episodic form I love telling episodic stories. It just does not make enough money to sustain itself. So unfortunately, like, we just can't keep doing it. It just doesn't turn the money back like it needs to. So we're continuing with as much of the On the Trail of stuff as we can, and actually we're expanding way beyond, you know, where we originally intended. But it's almost all going to be long form storytelling, except for On the Trail of Hauntings and probably On the Trail of the Lake Michigan Mothman, which will be a little bit of both.
Okay. And this stuff, is this stuff only going to be available on your YouTube, or?
So, yeah, we're still figuring that out. It's definitely only going to be available on YouTube for probably the next like 6 months. And then I think what it'll do is it'll go wider with like Amazon Prime and stuff like that, DVD and that kind of thing. But I think what we really want to do is expand that platform so we have a place to do the episodic storytelling where we can put the money into it that needs to go into it to make it really good and actually recoup the money we're putting into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does that work? Is it like a Patreon subscription to your channel?
Yeah, kind of. If you go, we were actually approached by YouTube about it. And during, so this is a beta thing. And so We launched last month. So yeah, you just go on the YouTube channel and you click the join. There's like a join button up at the top of the page on our channel. What it is, I mean, it goes far beyond just like this one series, and we have other series we want to launch. It's if you're a fan of Small Town Monsters, this is like the place you'll want to be. We have 2 different podcasts, video casts on there that we're recording, and those are going to start going live in the next like 2 weeks, where we record them live. And then there's all of our production diaries are going up on there. There's little like mini movies that we're posting on there. There's all sorts of stuff. There's like 20 hours of content on there already. Nice. So it's really cool. We're having a lot of fun with it.
Okay, and the main hub though is smalltownmonsters.com.
Yep, smalltownmonsters.com, and all the movies are on Amazon, and Tubi TV is a big free platform that they're on right now. If you're just interested in supporting us, you can buy DVDs and Blu-rays and posters and all that kind of stuff. But the movies are out there if you want to watch them for free.
And the last one you mentioned, the movie, what is that? I'm not familiar with that.
Which one?
I don't know, because I don't know the name you said. The last movie you're talking about.
Howl of the Rougarou?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be our look at like the Cajun Dogman, the Cajun werewolf down in Louisiana.
Okay, cool.
So that'll be probably that's our big movie release next year. We're only doing one of the standard STM docs next year. Everything else is on the trail of. We'll probably release that later in the year, like September.
Okay. And how many episodes are you looking at for all the On the Trail ofs?
Well, that's what I was saying. They're almost all going to be filmed. So On the Trail of UFO's Dark Sky is connected to the previous 8-episode series, but it's like a 70-minute movie.
I see. Okay.
But it's going to pick up a lot of the threads that we started with the series and really start expanding out of that core UFO mythology that everyone that is into UFOs is already aware of. And it's a really cool. It's pretty freaking cool. Like we went to West Virginia and basically made a movie all about UFO mythology or ufology in the state of West Virginia, but it goes to some really weird places. Men in Black, Injured Cold, UFOs coming out of coal mines, all sorts of weird stuff.
Nice. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for spending time with us, Seth.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I definitely recommend the I wanted to say the Mothman. I haven't seen the Mothman one yet. The Bell Witch documentary. What is it? The Mark of the Bell Witch, right?
Yep. Yeah.
All right. It's an excellent documentary, and it is done exceptionally well. So I look forward to more stuff from you.
Cool. Thanks, man.
And I want to take a moment here to send a thank you out to all of my Patreons. It's because of you that this show is possible, and I really mean that. And a special thank you and shout out to those pledging $10 or more: Super Inframan, Allison Cook, Tim, Nagatha Christie, Patricia W., Barbara Fisher, Will Powell, Big Boy Limina, Craig Parmenter, Walker, Johanna Rojas, Maddie, David Moore, Vincent Treewell, Stone Wilderness, Luke Osborne, Becky Trainer, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Edu Kamahort, Tactical Therapist, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Taylor, Sam Sharon, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, John Rutledge Foster III, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Sasha Jorg, Sedgder, Dominic O'Malley, Riker and Stark, J. Otto Bullitt, Jose A., Charles Davis, Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cisternos, Ray Benedetto, Linz Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Matthew Sproul, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Guy Quinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you all so very much. There's no extra Patreon segment with Seth Breedlove. However, he will be providing some viewing of the Bell Witch for Patreons. And if you want to become a Patreon, it really helps out the show if you can spare the $3 a month. Go to wheredidtheroadgo.com and click on the Patreon link. You get extra content all month long. And Yeah, occasionally stuff like this where you may be able to check out the Bell Witch documentary for free and before its release. And I will see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.